enjoyed yourself, please do. Okay. All right. Well, today we have Paul Werbos, who is going to talk to us about the brain. So take it away, Paul.
Okay, so these 34 slides cover a huge range of topics. And if we take this in a civilized way, we probably will only get so far as the brain of the mouse. And I won't say a whole lot about the soul here. I should say the slides I'm showing you are slightly updated from the slides I used on Monday to the IEEE in Tunisia. And I told the people in Tunisia I could talk about any of these 4 topics: climate extinction, the future of the internet, how they connect. And I also had a topic on my webpage, these are on my personal webpage, on minds, brains, and souls. And the people in Tunisia said, this is what we want to hear about. We want to hear about what is the connection between what we're building in computers, how brains work, and what this means for the human soul and the human spirit. It's kind of scary to try to discuss all that, even in 3 hours, let alone 1. The web page, which is at werbos.com, Minds, Brains, Souls, the web page has a lot of materials, starting from how brains work, through to connections between brain and soul, through to my understanding of how souls work. And there is science behind this understanding. But for reasons of time, I will probably focus only on new knowledge about the brain today. How to build brain-like intelligent systems. What is the mathematics of intelligent systems, which tells us how brains really work? That will be my main focus today. But let me emphasize, I don't say we don't have a soul. If we have time, I'll even start talking about how brains and souls connect as I see it. So now let me go to the next one here. Okay, so as an overview, I will only show the word soul on the overview. Doug has been asking a lot of questions about healing. Healing is one of the areas where we have to ask, who are we? What I've been telling Doug is, holistic healing means working together in symbiosis, the soul, the nervous system, the immune system, and the endocrine system. The brain, which I will talk about today, is just one part of the nervous system, which is one part of the larger system. I've spent a lot of time on the interactions between these, and I believe this interaction is important. But today, I'll basically just be talking about the brain, which is already important. And so let me say briefly, people ask, where is our consciousness? Who am I? My answer is, we are a symbiosis of this system and this system, actually all of these. We are a symbiosis, but we have to have a functioning brain in order to make it a good symbiosis. My claim is nobody can understand about their soul unless they understand about their brain, because a lot of our consciousness is here. There is a mathematics. There is a universal mathematics for all intelligent systems, machine intelligence, organic, or soul. But that mathematics is more complicated for the soul. So I claim we need to understand the brain and our own brain first as a prerequisite. So that's why I got to start here. Important as the soul is, I'm going to start focusing solely on the brain to begin with today. Oh my, I hope I didn't destroy one. Ah, good. Okay. Many people think that this is what science tells us about the brain. Many people believe that the brain works according to what you see in this picture. In fact, many presidents have proposed billion-dollar research programs to map the brain better. And what they mean is take this map of what lives in different parts of our cerebral cortex, the top of our brain, and find out more precisely where is the neuron that represents Mogadishu? Where is the neuron that represents a straight line? And they try to map all these things in the brain. And some people think this is how you understand the brain. You just map it. And there are people who are spending billions of dollars on mapping the brain. That has some value, but that doesn't tell you how brains work. This is not a good picture of how brains really work for several reasons. One reason is brains are different. People learn with time. What makes us intelligent is not where the edge detector lives this week in our brain. What makes us intelligent is how we learn all of these universal tasks. And the other thing is, what you're seeing here is only about half the brain. You are seeing what's called the neocortex. This is about 50% of the weight of the human brain. There is that other half, and that other half is extremely important. The other half is basically where our core feelings and emotions come from, what you don't see in this picture. Okay, so in the study of consciousness, we started to have a major new scientific push to understand consciousness about 20 years ago. And that generated two big international conferences every year on the science of consciousness. They have split up. Nowadays, I cynically say the two conferences, one is dominated by the people stuck in the mud, and the other is dominated by the people lost in the clouds. The people who are stuck in the mud will say, oh, my soul is here in the blue area. My consciousness is here in this area. And they'll have fights. My area, area 17.5, that's where consciousness is. And that is utterly silly. And we should know it is silly because science knows better. And let me show. There is a branch of neuroscience called systems neuroscience. Systems neuroscience is the place where people try to understand how the brain works as a whole system. They pay attention to the brain mapping, but they aren't just doing leaf collecting examples. They're trying to understand how the brain as a whole system works. So there are three branches of neuroscience I talk about a lot. There is that taxonomy stuff that we just saw. There is systems neuroscience. There's another field called computational neuroscience. Computational neuroscience tries to develop mathematical models of how brains work. Some people, you would think, aha, if you want to understand how a brain works, you need to know the equations. So these should be the same field. They aren't. Computational neuroscience today has lots and lots of low-level mathematical models inspired by that last slide. But systems neuroscience has been working for years to understand how the brain really works. Not everybody in neuroscience knows about systems neuroscience, but they should. The greatest systems neuroscientist maybe ever was a guy named Carl Lashley. And I sure hope if you ever do a web search, you'll see Carl Lashley was one of the very greatest neuroscientists ever. I tend to think of him maybe as he was the greatest neuroscientist ever. And he is famous for the discovery that the brain is a universal learning machine. It is a universal learning machine. So that if you say speech is located here, and then you get damage in that part of the brain, any other part of the brain, any other part of the neocortex can take over the function of the other one. Any part of the neocortex can learn anything that any other part can learn as long as the inputs are there, as long as you don't destroy the tissue. Carl Lashley invented the principle of mass action, which I think is the first thing we need to know. If you want to understand how brains work, for God's sake, start by remembering that they can learn. And if we forget that brains are universal learning machines, we don't begin to know what a brain really is. A brain is a universal learning machine. At least half of it is a universal learning machine. Lashley has long since died, but he had two really key followers, Carl Pribram and Walter Freeman. And when they were alive, I got to work with them very closely when I was at NSF and they were alive. I got to work with a lot of neuroscientists who had great things to say. I feel bad not giving them more credit, but at the end of the day, these were the two greatest systems neuroscientists in the world, as many of us would agree, until they died of old age. And a lot of what I say about the brain is based on asking them questions. In fact, maybe I should tell a story. When I first met Carl Pribram at a neuroscience conference, I remember he was very suspicious. People said, oh yeah, this Paul Werbos, he's president of the International Neural Network Society. He does those neural network models. And Carl is, oh my God, those people are all crazy. He meant the computational neuroscientist. He said, you've got to understand about the importance of emotions and some of the things Freud said. And I just agreed with him. And he was amazed. And ever since, we had a very close partnership, because my models of neural networks are very close to his models of the brain, and also Walter's. So should we go to the next slide, or do people want to ask questions? Okay, sounds like next slide. After Lashley's great discovery came out, after people started asking, how does the brain work as a universal learning machine, not as a collection of ad hoc apps? How does it work? I noticed one of you, James Boyd, works with Jerry Glenn, head of the Millennium Project. Jerry says we need to think about artificial narrow intelligence versus artificial general intelligence. Narrow intelligence is just a collection of specific apps for specific tasks. What about general intelligence? Lashley showed us the brain is general intelligence, but the question is how? What kind of mathematical model would allow us to understand, explain, and reproduce? How could the brain be a general purpose learning machine? What kind of dynamics would give it the power that we see in the brain? So one of the greatest people who followed after Lashley, not one of his students, was a guy named Donald Hebb. I usually say Donald Hebb was one of the two founders of the neural network field as we know it in engineering and computer science. And Hebb wrote a very famous book called The Organization of Behavior. I will never forget the summer of 1964. I had a summer job in hospital in Philadelphia, and they showed me this book. They were excited. The whole medical profession, they were excited by this book because this would explain how brains work, they thought. And he talked about the brain as a universal learning machine, and he proposed an equation in words. He said, if the neurons follow a certain law of learning, program an artificial neuron to do this, assume a brain made up of neurons governed by this learning rule, put 1 billion of those neurons together and they will learn everything. You don't need them to tell them what to do. You have a universal learning machine if you build a giant pile of neurons governed by this simple rule. And many neuroscientists were very excited by this concept. Most of computational neuroscience today still is based on this idea. It got translated into mathematics. It was called the Hebbian model. And that summer, I owed a paper on what I learned. So I said, okay, I'll program this and I'll describe it. But as I started to program it, I realized a sinking feeling. This isn't going to work. And that's the next slide. I knew enough math to know it wouldn't work. It turns out everybody in engineering really knows this. And most people in computational neuroscience don't. The reason is in computational neuroscience, you can publish a paper and model a local circuit of the brain or model one aspect. But in engineering, you have to learn to make predictions in a more complicated world. In engineering, you have to build systems which make decisions, and they have to work. And it turns out the Hebb rule doesn't work, because basically what it gives you are correlation coefficients. And we all know that if you just predict based on correlation coefficients, when you have many variables you're trying to use as inputs, that's just going to give you stupid predictions, really bad predictions. And in 1964, I got a feeling in the pit of my stomach, oh my God, it won't work. I later learned you can build an associative memory with correlation coefficients. And there's a guy named Stephen Grossberg and a guy named Cahonen. It is possible to design neural networks for memory. And these associative memories are useful, and you can use them as components of the brain. And I now believe that some parts of the brain, like small cells in the neocortex, they might use the Hebb rule. They might do that because they give you memory, and memory is one piece. But the brain is not a memory machine. You know how people develop biases when they talk too much from a certain ideology? I've been to conferences where neuroscientists would say, of course, the brain is nothing but a memory machine. And why do they believe that? The only mathematical model they have is good for associative memory. So they start to believe the whole brain is nothing but a memory machine. And you know very well you are not just a memory machine. You are not just an appliance used to play the game of Jeopardy, for God's sake. But a lot of people start to think that way because it's the only mathematical model they know. It's useful for a part of the brain, but not for the whole thing. Even for linear prediction, good old-fashioned regression, we know correlation coefficients won't do the job. So the bottom line is, okay, if Hebb's model doesn't work, what works? And that is something I have worked on. So my claim is what the brain is as a whole system. We have to understand what it does before we can get into the pieces. The brain as a whole system is an intelligent controller. The brain as a whole system gets sensory input. Its function in biology is to output actions. Some of these are like muscle actions. Some of these are like secretions inside the body. But in general, the function of the brain in evolution is to calculate actions which contribute to the survival of the organism and the species. Now, how do you know when you're contributing to the survival of the species? There are also biological mechanisms which are called primary reinforcement. I don't believe in the theories of B.F. Skinner about how the human brain and the animal brain work, but they have some truth in them. When I was an undergraduate, B.F. Skinner was the psychologist. B.F. Skinner said, intelligence is all about learning. Animal learning and human learning are the same. That's where I disagree, because they're different kinds of learning in different species. But basically, he said, you use primary reinforcement, reward and punishment to train an animal. I say, nature gives us ways to evaluate how well we're doing. It gives us things like pain and pleasure. There are and hunger. There are things which biology measures, which serve as signals of reward or reinforcement. And the brain learns over time how to maximize the quality of the results which come from its actions. So the brain as a whole is an intelligent controller. And I've heard neuroscientists say, but what does that have to do with the mice? Well, consider, a mouse is a product of evolution. It's not just some video game dreamed up by a human. The mouse evolved to maximize its probability of survival as it runs across a very difficult, complex environment.
I'm so upset I get cut you, you'll pay $50,000.
Hello. Okay, so this is the basic idea.
Oh.
Sorry. So basically, when I started thinking about how to fix up Hebb, in 1964, I started to think, okay, if the Hebb model doesn't work, how can I come up with a model which does work in matching brains and building artificial intelligence? In terms of the animal behavior people, I read a lot of books at Harvard about theories of animal behavior. And there are people called ethologists who say animals are pre-programmed to generate certain results, stimulus response. And I used to tell these people, it's not stimulus response for a human. A low level of animal may have genes which tell us the stimulus response pattern. Low level animals may have genes which program what the outputs are as a function of the inputs. But we are learning systems. And the essence of our learning is we learn to take actions which lead to better results. And in order to get better results, there is no alternative. In order to get better results, we need to have a system to evaluate the results. And intelligence is about learning how to make better choices. And it starts from von Neumann. Any questions before I move on?
Yeah, lots of them, but keep going.
Okay.
I have a few too.
Well, let's try a few.
So can we go back to the reinforcement? Is that the limbic system you're talking about?
Let me go.
You had the brain, the
No,
image of the
don't
brain.
worry. You're seeing my eyeball problems. It's one thing to have a brain. Okay.
Oh yeah,
So this is the whole brain.
the whole brain.
And what I say to people is, yeah, we know there's a lot of pattern recognition in there. And we know there's a whole lot of other stuff in there. There are subsystems which are important. There are very important subsystems in the brain, which I will get to. But you cannot understand what a subsystem is trying to do unless you know what its function is in the whole system. Okay? So the limbic system is a very important part of the whole system. Some people call it the emotional system. And in a way, I used to think of the limbic system as kind of half the brain, the half you don't see in the middle that controls everything. It's not exactly half, but it's kind of like it's half the brain, kind of. And so it's very important. And I'll try to get to it.
Thanks, Paul. This is awesome.
And other questions? Okay, well, I'll get to some of the details. And there are a lot of questions beyond this, I know. Okay, so now let me, so after years and years of doing this, I was very grateful that in about 2008, 2007, 2008, the National Science Foundation gave me a mandate to organize a new research topic to tell us how brains really work based on these concepts of optimization and prediction. This was organized by the engineering directorate of NSF because they didn't want to build the kind of artificial neuron model that does nothing but imitate behavior we don't want to imitate. They wanted to build brain-like intelligent systems which actually do something. And the engineering directorate, I said, brains learn to optimize over time. A mouse is not born knowing how to maximize its probability of survival, but it learns as fast as it can. And those mice who are alive today are those that learn faster. Evolution gives the brain many capabilities. It's not only a learning machine. Some parts of the brain really are pre-programmed algorithms, especially down at the lower levels. But the higher levels of the brain are this kind of universal learning machine. What does it learn? And what I said is there are two tasks that brains learn to perform better and better as we get older, as we train ourselves. And those are prediction and optimization. I'm afraid we might need to mute somebody if we can't hear.
James,
so
could you
predict-
mute James Memo? Could we request you mute, please?
Yeah. So NSF gave me permission to organize program directors from all over the foundation. It was like a bottom-up town meeting to design the research strategy for how to understand and build an organic brain, but also to build an artificial version of it. In my view, this research calling is still the best strategy anybody has today for how to understand the brain better. I know a lot about how the brain works. There's a lot I don't know, but this research strategy is still viable today. If you go to the NSF webpage, www.nsf.gov, you can search on the letters COPN, which stand for Cognitive Optimization and Prediction Neural. And that will give a detailed research strategy. That research strategy gives us choices. There are things we don't know about the brain. Here are some experiments and research we could do to find out. But it also gives examples of what a mouse brain can do and what we do know. So I believe that this, even though it's 10 years old, I believe that this research strategy is more advanced than any of the brain research strategies I'm seeing in the press these days. I see a lot of brain research strategies that look like billion-dollar efforts to give money to drug companies for mapping the brain. You know, ways to give out a lot of money, but not ways to find the truth. To find the truth, we focused on the questions in this research solicitation. And basically, there are 5 research questions that we focused on. We found that the basic mathematics was mostly divided into 2 pieces. There are people building universal prediction machines, which learn to predict. I guess you could call this the cognitive half of it. And then the optimization part, which learns to make decisions over time. So this is the overall organization of the brain, how to learn optimal decisions over time. But it turns out you can't make a good decision in a complex world if you don't know what's happening in the world. And if you can't predict the results of your actions, it's hard to come up with a good strategy of action. So the brain brings these 2 things together, but in a practical sense, we really had 2 major streams of research. It had to be mathematically grounded. There are universal mathematical principles which apply to artificial systems, brains, even souls, I claim. Every one of these equations deserves at least an hour, so I can't give it an hour now, but maybe I should name them because these are the real foundations. Everything follows from these foundations. There is this little equation, which is called Bayes' law. A lot of people think they know what Bayesian inference is. Bayes' law is bigger than what they know. This mathematical principle is much more powerful than most people know, but it is one of the things that leads to better prediction. There are things called memory and clustering. I mentioned associative memory. That's important. Clustering, that's part of the brain in the lower levels. And then the biggest part is optimization. This is what keeps us alive. If there's any one equation that describes how an intelligent brain works, this is the equation. And I'll explain more about what it says. There are actually several variations, but the one I'm giving here is the basic Bellman equation, due to a guy in California who was a friend of John von Neumann. I've even talked to his daughter in these conferences, and we've talked about the old times with John von Neumann. John von Neumann came up with the U, the cardinal utility function. John von Neumann argued that any rational decision maker will have a cardinal utility function. A rational decision must have a way of deciding what are better results. You have to know what you want if you want to get it. You have to have a cardinal utility function. But if the only thing you know is what you want in the long term, you're going to have troubles figuring out how to get there. You need a practical measure of progress, and that's what I call J. Some people in computer science now call it V for value function. I use a different notation. I may explain why if I get time. But the original equation uses a J and a U, at least in the control theory books. And the whole idea in this equation is when you know what you want, you can learn what your measure of progress is. There's another equation on the bottom. And this is equation which I developed. Proving it was one major part of my PhD thesis. I call it the chain rule for ordered derivatives. Some people call it backpropagation. But what they call backpropagation is actually a small special case. We actually need the general case. And what this does is it tells us how to compute the impact of anything at the bottom on the outcome at the top. That's crudely what it is. And if I had an hour, I would explain a lot more about what that is. So anyway, these equations can be used to build an intelligent system. And we also in engineering learned how new intelligent systems can be critical enablers to allow us to solve problems which we cannot solve without more general intelligence. Sustainability on Earth, climate issues, that's one of them. There are space applications which are critical to the future of humans in space. And then there is human potential. And if we had more than an hour, I'd spend a lot of time because this is why I took the job. Understanding intelligence in the brain is a step towards understanding our capabilities as humans, our potential to use our brains better, and also our potential to use our connections to other humans, to nature, and to the soul. Understanding this mathematics, I took the job because I wanted to help this part of it. Okay, so now, I was the first person who actually figured out a general neural network design for what they call artificial general intelligence. And my idea was very simply, let's approximate a proven mathematical technique called dynamic programming. People in control theory have known about dynamic programming for many, many decades. As I say, this equation comes from Bellman, who used to hang out with John von Neumann. Some people say the equation is older than that. God, I'm tempted to talk about the math, but let me not. This equation is the equation that you use to find out your J. The concept of dynamic programming in engineering, which is much older than I am, the concept of dynamic programming in engineering, the user supplies a stochastic model of the plant they want to control or the environment, a model of reality. The user must supply a utility function U. And then by solving this equation gives you another function called J, which I call a secondary or strategic utility function. And the basic idea here is you learn over time what you could do in the present to get what you want in the future. So U is kind of like pain or pleasure. The things born into animal brains, born into human brains. And there are specific organs in the brain which track what I would call U, epithalamus, hypothalamus especially. But then we need a system to figure out how well we are doing. We need usable measures of progress. So I'm saying that usable measures of progress must be the center of any true intelligent system, artificial or natural. Any real intelligent system must have components which estimate how well they are doing. Because how can you make a decision if you don't know how well you are doing? This is kind of the center of things. In a way, I'm saying the human brain is a hopes and fears machine. It's a machine that learns what its hopes and fears are and acts on its hopes and fears. In a way, they're two halves of the brain. One acts on the hopes and fears, and one decides what are its hopes and fears. Are things looking good? Are they looking bad? This is a big learning task. Earlier today, Terry was asking, what about the limbic system? What about the emotions? Well, this is basically what the emotions are about. Most computer science experts in AI know very little about this. In fact, just a few years ago, they knew nothing. It was really sad. But in engineering, a lot of people do know because that's where this came from, and also from neuroscience. In the modern literature, the mathematics of how to do this is called reinforcement learning and approximate dynamic programming, RLADP. RLADP, these are the code letters that will get you to the real stuff. And in the world of RLADP, this is not the only design. There are other designs of the same family that are more powerful and more general. You may have heard of AlphaGo. AlphaGo, the original AlphaGo was based on a very simple member of the RLADP family. So simple, it almost doesn't qualify. 20 years ago, the US and China were doing missile interception by using more advanced forms of RLADP, more universal, more scaling than anything these computer scientists know about even today. And they were in use 20 years ago, and they work. To learn about RLADP, the best source I know of in English in a single book is the Handbook of RLADP, which came out as a book from IEEE in 2013. And this was a big part of what I funded. I guess it was about half the program, because about half is optimization, half is prediction.
Hey, Paul,
Yeah.
I don't want you to get sidetracked, but could you just take a minute to talk a little bit about U and R and where they come from and how they might change?
Okay. Yeah. So
Or if it's too long, we'll leave it.
No. I'm just trying to figure out how to sequence. I should probably say I skipped over a minor little detail. I was the one who figured out the idea of building a reinforcement learning system by approximating dynamic programming. And I will forever remember how I got that idea while I was hitching a ride in a Volkswagen to Wellesley for a mixer. I mean, talking to a guy who knew about dynamic programming. So what are these things? So U, as I say, it's the cardinal utility function of von Neumann, except time indexed. But the real issue is, okay, what are we maximizing over time? And since you know economics, of course, you ask, what is the goal? Is the goal to maximize the sum of big U over all future time? That's what I was thinking of in the beginning, because animals need to survive over all future time. That's what decides who lives. But in practice, in real world economics, we often want to inject an interest rate R. So that's what this little R is, an interest rate. And sometimes when you apply dynamic programming in economics, you say, I want to maximize not my profits next year, not the sum of profits over all future years. I want to maximize the present value, the discounted flow of all future profits. So basically, I want to maximize the sum of my current profits plus next year's profits discounted by R%, plus the year after that discounted twice by R%. And in that case, you use dynamic programming to maximize your expected profits over time, discounted by the interest rate R. And the choice of the interest rate R is a very important issue. We could talk about that for an hour. Okay. And like I said, this was something I actually put together the first specification of a general intelligent learning system based on this principle, connected also to neural nets, was in my Harvard PhD thesis in 1972. But then there are a whole lot of later papers where I explained it better and better. So, oh yeah, and I should mention, in order to solve that kind of control problem, I needed to be able to calculate derivatives. And furthermore, I used ideas from Sigmund Freud. Okay. When people are new to a field like computers, they like to pretend that the whole world is nothing but the tool they learn in their first course. That's a natural human instinct. But to make deep progress, we need to make connections to new sources of ideas. When I came up with the first workable design for RLADP, when I came up with the first workable design for RLADP or for neural network learning in general, I needed a source of inspiration. I spent a lot of time before that learning about Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud had a theory called the Project for a Scientific Psychology. And it's really important to appreciate who Freud was and what he did. He went to medical school long before he started treating hysterical patients to make money. When he was in medical school, he studied brain stuff somewhat. And he had a theory of how flows of information in the brain from neuron to neuron could create good decision making over time. And a lot of my mathematical ideas came from translating Freud's ideas into English. This reminds me of the way the world gets to be divided into three parts. There are people who would laugh at Freud and say, bunch of psychology, can't be anything, can't mean anything. And then there are another bunch of people who would say, Freud, the great god of sex, let's get deep into it. Let's have orgies, let's have fun. I think I was the only person in a population of 1 billion who took the middle road between those two extremes. And I said, I think there's some real empirical data there. There's something real out there, but we need better math if we want to really understand how it works. So after I translated into mathematics, that's how I came up with these designs. When I wrote a book on the history of backpropagation, Carl Pribram, the systems neuroscientist guy, was really excited. Pribram wrote a book on Freud. It's the best interpretation of Freud's theory you will find anywhere. And Freud was a very deep thinker on deep issues of how brains work. He got much further than most people know. And Pribram's endorsement of my book basically shows you, yes, backpropagation and this crazy Werbo stuff, it does what Freud was trying to do, but with better math. So it really is a model, not just of tissues, but of human thinking, of the human mind. Okay, so after I say the human brain evolved to be such a powerful optimization machine, learning how to use billions of neurons to get the best possible results, how come we can find rinky-dink baby neural nets that are less sophisticated that outperform humans in many applications? Back in the 90s, I worked a little bit with a major financial firm, John Deere, and I showed them how to use neural networks on the stock market. And they were earning 6% over Dow for many years. They were the most successful for a few years till other people discovered this was good and jumped on the game. And people have asked me, how is it that a simple neural network with only 100 neurons in finance outperforms human analysts with billions of neurons? This is really an important question. How is it the same neural net principles in a simplified form with only a few hundred neurons, why are they outperforming humans on the internet today? And humans are losing jobs. And it's becoming more and more serious because of people using simple neural networks with 100 neurons to outperform humans with billions. Why is that if human brains are so powerful? And the answer is right here on this slide. The difference is these artificial neural nets are paying attention. Those stockbrokers are not paying attention. They are paying attention to their neighbors, their friends, the morning. If humans knew how to pay attention, we have the brains, we have the ability to pay attention. If we learn to use what's in our own brains, we can outperform these simple neural networks. And I've seen many examples of that in real industry where they used the neural nets to train real humans, and then the humans started doing better. Operations research people have lots of stories like that. So way back when I was 14 and 15, I did not believe there was such a thing as a soul. I believed that was silliness. But I knew that the brain had billions of neurons. So I asked myself, how can we learn to pay more attention and be more effective? What is the barrier? How can we do better? My claim is the main barrier is the gap between the symbolic word level of our thought and the big rat brain, which is 95% of the human brain. 95% of the human brain is biologically the same exact structures you see in a rat, the exact same structures. In fact, it's probably more than 95%. It looks like the same thing. We need to connect our powerful, ancient, sub-symbolic thought with our new verbal thought and get them to work together. And if we do that, we can outperform the simple neural nets. We can achieve feats that people used to think were impossible. And the story of hypnotism says that. And when I was in high school, I said, hey, I want to be more effective. I said, I don't know how to fix Heb, but when I am an undergraduate at Harvard, I will try to fix up Heb, and I will try to make my brain work better. I will focus my brain to be able to solve this problem better. So those were two things I resolved at the end of high school. And this was a great book. Now let's see. Okay, forgive me. My brain is working, but my eyeballs are not quite as good lately. Okay. So what came out of all that? What do we understand about brains and consciousness? The next thing we need to know, the first thing we need to know about intelligence and brains is it's a universal learning system. Maybe the second thing is it's goal-oriented. And the third thing is there are many levels and levels of intelligence and brain out there in the natural world. Sometimes people will look at a computer program and they'll say, if I do this program, if I start running this program, this neural network program, is this thing going to think anything? Is it going to feel anything? If I implement this program, will it be a conscious system? Is this a person I've programmed? Is it or isn't it? Is it conscious or isn't it? I've heard a lot of people ask that question. And there are people who write books on philosophy. Is it conscious or isn't it? And my answer is, before you learn to answer the question, you need to ask the question correctly. It's a wrong question. It's a wrong question because this is not a binary variable. Intelligent systems come in many kinds. There are many levels of intelligence, even for artificial general intelligence, even for universal learning machines. There are more and more powerful designs. There's like a ladder of designs you can build. And if we look out there in nature, there's a certain kind of capability you see in the reptile, the bird, the mammal, the symbolic. There was a great psychologist at Bryn Mawr University, good Quaker college. There was a psychologist named Bitterman who did experimental psychology way beyond what B.F. Skinner knew about. Okay? This guy, Bitterman, did experiments on the qualitative differences. There's some kinds of things which mammals can learn. There's some kind of things which birds can learn. I will never forget the story of the turtle in Bitterman's paper in Scientific American. I hate to say it reminded me of some politicians, but everybody knows you can do an experiment where you put something like you put an animal to make a choice. It picks red, it gets a reward. It picks blue, it gets punishment. And gradually it learns to pick the right color or to pick the right side. Everybody knows that kind of learning experiment. It's very old. But then he did what's called pattern reversal. What happens if you switch it? So red used to be good, but then blue is good, and you got to switch to blue. And then you got to learn to switch again. If you teach a turtle to do that, it just goes crazy. It's like first it learns it's supposed to go to the left. Then when you switch it, it takes more time to unlearn what it knew and learn something new. And then you switch it again, it takes more time, and it just goes crazy. It's as if the turtle is saying, you can't make up your mind, I'm going crazy, I just can't do this. If you do that with a monkey or a rat, it instantly learns, oh God, it's that human switching things again. And the next time you switch, it goes instantly. So there are fundamental capabilities in mammal brains beyond what you get in reptile brains. And so there's a whole ladder of levels of intelligence. And we now have mathematical designs for different levels of general intelligence. I'm talking about intelligent systems all the way. I'm talking about systems where AlphaGo is at the bottom of the bottom. There's a whole ladder of ever more general, more universal designs for intelligent systems. Now let's see. Now I tell you, oh, I actually came close to the right slide. So there are levels and levels of intelligence. And so what I have done is figured out what these levels are, how to build levels of intelligence all the way up to the level of the mouse brain. I have a roadmap for the prediction half and a roadmap for the optimization half. And I actually have 2 papers on this. But did I show you the slides for both papers? Aha, let me check. Okay, we got this one. Okay. And one more. Oh my, okay. Okay, so through the years, through NSF research, through a whole lot of work, I have learned an entire roadmap, levels and levels, how to build the lowest level of universal intelligence system. This is the kind of thing we use for missile interception. AlphaGo is at the bottom of this class. I call these vector prediction systems. Then the next level up, there are ways to use symmetry, which give you a level of intelligence that these systems cannot have. Many people are excited by the new convolutional networks, which are part of the new excitement in deep learning and in computer science. I funded a guy named LeCun to use a type of neural network which I had developed. And when it worked, people at Google were impressed. They are using convolutional neural networks which exploit symmetry in space in the Euclidean model. But that's not the best you can do, because higher up on the ladder, you can use general non-Euclidean neurons. And in engineering, we have demonstrated more powerful neural nets which do things which convolutional networks cannot. We've demonstrated problems where the more advanced intelligence systems work better than the old convolutional systems. But you go a step up. At the reptile level, you are organizing not only space, but time. And there are ways to learn to organize time. And we have a lot of mathematics on how to do optimal decisions when you must organize time. And this is the great power of the dinosaur. It's a very decisive organism. And we have the mathematics. But the highest in this chart is the mouse, because the mouse has a kind of creativity system. And if we had time, I can show you the equations. There are mathematics and details of all of this. There's a web page where I have a lot of the mathematics. And not only in understanding, but in optimal decision-making, the mouse has capabilities which are far beyond the kind of systems people are using today. So that basically goes up to the level of the mouse. But now let me say, probably the end of this talk, if I'm out of time, I claim that the brain of a mouse is governed by this kind of mathematics, that it uses the kind of, actually, did I show you my relevant brain slide? There should be more to it than this. I'm sorry, I may have had problems showing you all my slides. It's my problem clicking here. Because as I said, there's a prediction and there's a decision part of the brain that are both important. Okay, because it turns out there's also a lot of empirical work. And maybe I have, yes, I do have a slide on the empirical work. Good. Somehow it didn't show the slides I meant to show, but okay. Okay, now I know what's happening. The prediction part of the brain. My claim is the brain is a universal learning machine. It's not doing Hebbian learning. If we think it's just association, we won't know how brains work. But there are these two parts, the prediction half and the decision half. The prediction half of the brain, we now know much better than we did 20 years ago. After Pribram and Freeman died, there are two new leaders in the field of cognitive neuroscience, systems neuroscience. If I were still working at NSF, these two people, Nikolaos and also Busacki, who's down here, there are two people, Nikolaos and Busacki, who are the two leading system neuroscientists in the world today. Nikolaos I met in one of Pribram's workshops. Nikolaos had a great paper in Science, which made his career. He was studying something called the whisker system of the rat. He was studying how the brain of the rat works. We all know that there are sensors which create a bunch of variables. I think of it as a vector input, sensor vector input X. And we all know that sensor observations are registered in a part of the brain called the thalamus. The thalamus functions as, I call it the movie screen of the brain. The image appears on the movie screen, and the cerebral cortex, which is the higher prediction understanding, watches the movie screen, learns how the world works. So this system learns how the world works. My claim is that the universal learning principle of the cerebral cortex is learning to predict. Or strictly speaking, that's the first of three functions, but that's the big first one. The cerebral cortex actually evolved in animals lower than the mammal. There is cortex in lower animals. It learned to predict. It is a system which learns to predict. So this is the universal learning rule. The universal learning rule is not correlation coefficients. The universal learning rule is to adapt the neural nets in this circuit, which connect the thalamus to the cerebral cortex back to the thalamus, so that it can predict what it will see in the future. Prediction is the universal principle which controls all of the higher learning of the neocortex. That was just my theory. I publish it in many places, but could anybody believe it? Then came empirical data. Nikolaos was studying the brain of a rat. He used as his example tweaking the whiskers. You tweak the whiskers, you know what the inputs are. We know where the tweaks are registered in the thalamus. We know where the input comes in. We know what it looks like. And then when Nikolaos looked nearby, he discovered that there are cells near those input cells which predict the other cells in advance. There was one crazy guy named Libet who said, oh my God, it's parapsychology. These cells are using ESP to predict their neighbors. Well, I believe in ESP, but I don't believe that theory. That's pretty silly. But there's still people who quote it. There's still people who believe it must be magic. But there are cells which serve as advanced predictors of the other cells. And when I saw this, when Nikolaos and Chapin presented this in one of Pribram's workshops, I walked up to him and said, you know what? Why don't we collaborate here? He said, fine. He said he'll do it. He did it. Didn't cite where the idea came from. But at any rate, he did it. He did the experiment I recommended. And what I recommended was very simple. It's a good predictor now. You've got the rat there in your lab. Why don't you do a lesion? Or why don't you do some crazy changes in the environment? Why don't you set it up so that this cell no longer predicts this cell very well, and then see, through learning, does it relearn? Does the circuit cause learning so that the circuit will relearn how to be a good prediction? In other words, learning to predict, I predict, is what governs the learning of this circuit. He tested it, he found out it works. It does predict, it fits the data. What's more, this cerebral cortex is not exactly a black box. We know what's in there. This is an actual photograph of what's in there. I'll try not to talk about it for an hour here, but the bottom line is we have an artificial mathematical neural network model of how to learn this kind of prediction in the face of noise and imperfect observation. It's kind of like common filtering, but it's the nonlinear generalization of common filtering, which I published way back in the 1990s. It maps exactly into what we see in the cells of the neocortex, explaining how prediction is done. So now,
Paul, at the top of the hour or beyond, this is totally fascinating, and I'm just wondering if people do have questions, they could put them in the chat box so we could continue on with your presentation, or we could stop soon and then arrange for a second
we're
presentation.
close to a good stopping point.
Okay.
Okay. After I retired from NSF, I decided I would do some of the hardcore research work I wanted to fund. Now I could just do it. So I collaborated with a guy named Yeshua Ben David and published a paper. This is not the flagship journal of the field, and that doesn't help in citations, but this was an honorary issue, well-reviewed, dedicated to Walter Freeman. It was kind of his final thing. And this paper shows empirically that the model I just described fits empirical data better than anything you will find in computational neuroscience. We have real empirical time series results showing you need back propagation and forward propagation to train such a system. The philosophers will say, oh, that's impossible. My brain would never do such a dirty engineering thing. But real biology says it does. And the data says it does. And if you go to the paper, you'll learn about the very best data. This paper is the best statement that exists in the literature today on how a mammal brain works and on what we can do to go beyond that. And we compare, there's lots of empirical work in that paper. The best old models that come from any branch of neuroscience, we cut the error in half compared to all of the best models anybody else has. So this isn't just functional theory. It isn't just engineering. It actually fits real-time series data on what exists in real brains. So that's, if I were still at NSF, maybe I'd really encourage people to follow up, because this is really the beginning. Now we know what kind of model describes the brain. We should be filling in. There's a lot more to do. So thank you. Thank you for your patience.
So at this point, do people have I can go around and ask people for their takeaways. I will ask,